Hello, welcome back to Your Story Stinks, Episode 5. This time we're going to be doing something a little different. Two things that are going to be different. First, I'm going to be talking about something that I personally enjoy, and we'll get into that. And second, I'm not running off a script this time. See, for the last couple episodes, I've scripted everything out in advance, and that way you get a nice condensed, 20-minute or so episode. But I figured, this time, since I'm supposed to be doing a podcast of some kind, I figured I would kind of ad-lib this one. Got some notes, and we'll see how it works, because all of this is ad hoc, and I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. So, without any further ado, let's just get into this. So, this time we're going to be talking about something that I personally enjoy, because it is my belief that even if you enjoy something, that doesn't mean you can't critique it. In fact, in some levels, I think you should critique things harsher when you enjoy them, because things you enjoy you should hold to a higher standard. So, keep that in mind when I'm talking about this. So, we're talking about Kengan Omega, which is the sequel to Kengan Ashura. Now, Ashura is a fantastic series. It's a fantastic manga, and you should absolutely read it. I don't particularly like the anime, because my belief with series like it is that you don't get the same feeling with the anime that you get with the manga. And that's almost always my opinion on just about everything in terms of adaptations. I dislike adaptations in general, normally, because you're always gaining something and losing something. So, for example, I talked about this in my Harry Potter episode, that when you translate something from book to movie, you lose the ability for the author to control what the audience experiences. So, for example, when you have a book, your only perspective is what the author is imparting upon the reader. Whereas in a movie, you have editing, you have actors, you have music, you have all of these things that can manipulate the audience or change how the audience thinks and feels about characters. So, for that reason, I focus entirely on the manga side of Ashura, because it's, I don't want to say stylized, but it's one of those things where the author has a very good grasp of how and when to emphasize things. And I feel that's lost in motion, because you're adding so much more information that you can't emphasize things the same way you do in manga. And it's kind of the same way with comics, where not as much in comics, because comics haven't evolved in like 30 years and they've stagnated, but it's the same concept of whatever you put on page is meant to emphasize or tell something to the audience. So, having said all of this, like I said, Ashura is a great series. It is a fantastic manga. It has fantastic characters that are all memorable. There's probably not a bad fight in the series. There is almost nothing in terms of characterization that goes, I don't want to say too far, but it's kind of like everything has a place and everything is interesting, and it doesn't have a lot of the problems that a lot of other series do, where there are so many characters that you lose track of your main character. So one of the problems with a lot of ensemble series is that the side characters can take over a series, and you start losing an idea of who is your protagonist. That's one of the main problems with things like Berserk, where Griffith just takes over the series and you're like, where's the plot going? Who is moving it forward? Who are we supposed to be rooting for? Where are we going with any of this? Ashura does not have any of that problem. Because it's clear from the beginning that Oma is your main character. You follow his development, and while there are lots of other characters and you watch their fights, because of the way that they're all introduced, and because of how the author focuses on them and develops them, no one really feels unneeded, and no one feels like they overstay their welcome. So even minor characters who only have like one fight are interesting and well fleshed out because the author takes the opportunity to create stakes for everything. So one thing we'll get into with Omega when we start talking about that is this problem of lack of stakes, which Ashura does not have because the author makes sure to embody every single fight as a like live or die situation where it's clear why everybody is fighting, it's clear what the stakes are, and everything has purpose. So even though Oma is our protagonist ostensibly, we as the audience can root for and enjoy the rest of the cast in a way that doesn't take away from him. In fact, one of the interesting things is how he transitions throughout the series. So, like, in the beginning, he's very standoffish, he's hyper-aggressive, he's a delinquent-style character, but he's got lots of bloodlust, and as the series progresses, he opens up to people, he learns stuff about himself, he comes to grips with a lot of things, and it's all really well done, because you can see clearly from the beginning to the end his journey. And it's a clear journey, and the author does not skimp out, and doesn't skip steps, and doesn't rush anything. So it's entirely believable that other characters like him. It's believable when other characters who have fought him come around to his side, because everybody has seen his journey, including we, the audience. So, in comparison to a lot of other series where the arc of acceptance, I guess you could call it, where a protagonist is a bit of an outsider and then slowly becomes accepted, is often rushed and kind of stilted. So, a good example of this problem is like Bleach or Naruto, where rather than having a clear arc that progresses gradually, you end up with these stilted steps where you either time skip or you just move on to the next arc, and it's like everybody's social relationships have changed, but you don't see it. It's like they have in arc A, everybody's social relationships are defined. And then the arc ends. And then arc B starts, and everybody's social relationships have changed, and now you need to reestablish all of their social relationships. That's how a lot of shonen manga does progression. That's not what Ashura does. Ashura is very much a very good gradual slope. Now, that's not to say it doesn't have flaws, because Ashura has a number of flaws, but the flaws don't overpower its strengths in the sense that they're forgettable. So one of the main problems or background issues that Ashura has is that Ashura has a lot of stuff going on in the background and a lot of subplots that aren't particularly interesting because of all the things I've already said. So, like, all of the interest in the characters and the fighters and their fights has almost nothing to do with all of the side plots running in the background when it's like scheming in underground and evil organizations and criminals and like all this stuff is in the running in the background that's only vaguely mentioned most of the time and is not particularly important. So, like, there's a running plot point where a number of the characters are part of a place called the Inside, and it's like this uninhabited, or not uninhabited, but lawless, abandoned area that the government doesn't control and doesn't even attempt to control, and the people who live in there basically do whatever they want, and like everything's legal essentially, and the people who live in there are not a part of normal society, basically, and that's a running subplot, but it's not particularly interesting because it's not important. Like, the place itself isn't important. Like, the characters and how they interact is important, but the place itself is not meant to be like a plot point. Another running thing is like the scheming between factions in the Kengan administration or association, and it's not super important after about halfway through. I mean, it is, but it's not like the thing that takes over the narrative, because it's a running, like, it's the story, it's the thing that establishes the story and establishes the conditions for the story, but the scheming in the background is not the thing that you're supposed to focus on the most. So it's there, but cleverly the writer understands that just having people talk in rooms is not interesting. And so he cleverly understands that the best way to portray backroom dealing and scheming is to have all of these things be solved through proxies. So you have fighters who are fighting for things because they represent corporations who want things. And a lot of the times the fighters and the corporations want the same thing, so you have stakes. But the backroom dealing and scheming parts are not particularly in the forefront. So once you get to the tournament, because the entire series is essentially a tournament arc, it's no longer like, it no longer has to establish, like, okay, this is what this corporation is, and this is what they want, and you don't need to do a whole lot of, like, detailing. It's enough to say, this is a pharmaceutical company, and they want to control the Kengan Association because it would give them lots of power. And that, like, that's all you need. You don't need to give in detail what this corporation is and how it works. You don't need any of that. It's enough to establish that. And so the weakest parts of Ashura is that all of the backroom stuff is not as interesting as the fighters or their motivations and their fights. So all of, like, that can be in the background, and the audience can just kind of use it as garnish, essentially, to the meal that is all of the fighting, which is fantastic. Now, having said all this, one thing that I mentioned, I think, again, in the Harry Potter episode, but I've probably mentioned it before, is one of the biggest problems that writers have, especially when you're making a series, is bigger your scope, the bigger your problems. And this absolutely applies to Kengan Omega, because everything that Ashura does well, Omega does poorly, because Omega takes all of the flaws that I've now mentioned, and it makes those the forefront. And it kind of just doesn't work. So, without wasting more time, let's just kind of get into what I mean by that. So, Omega really wants to try and flesh out the world, which is the least interesting part of the Kengan universe, because it's not really important or interesting to the reader. So the reader doesn't need or doesn't care about the makeup of the world, because what we're focused on are the fighters and their fights and their personal journeys. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make a series about underground fighters and then make the scope of it worldwide, because no one cares. It's too much information and taking too much of the focus away from the things that we, the audience, care about. The other main problem is that there's a much bigger focus on the worm. So in Ashura, the worm is kind of mentioned a little bit, but they're not really fleshed out. In Omega, the worm is everywhere and is constantly prevalent, and we see their inner workings, and everything turns into a scheme by the worm. Everything turns into what is the worm doing? How do we stop them? And it's just not very interesting, because this is a series about fighters and what they're fighting. So why the hell are we focusing on the worm, which has not much to do with either besides wanting power and authority? There's a scene where the worm becomes a worldwide terrorist organization and starts committing terrorist acts in other countries. They graffiti the Statue of Liberty and stuff, and it's our series takes place in Japan. It is a Japanese-focused series. None of the fighters, or almost none of the fighters, are from America or from Europe. There's three. There's Adam Dudley, there's Julius Reinhold, and that's basically it in terms of non-Asian Asian fighters. And so you see all this worldwide stuff and you're where are we going with this? Why does it matter? Because it's not the interesting part of the series. It would be one thing if this was okay, so the Kengan Association is going to fight the worm, and they're going to fight the worm corporation. If the worm was a corporation group, and this was all subterfuge and all about corporation scheming and trying to hostile take over each other, that would be a good backdrop, but it's not. The worm is just a terrorist organization, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of the same problem that Street Fighter has, where it's why on earth are Street Fighters fighting a secret organization? Why would you need to do that? Why is the scope all over the place? And that's ironic, because there's a crossover with Street Fighter and Ashura, which isn't particularly good, but that's not here nor there. So there's way too much focus on the background stuff. There's way too much focus on the worm. There's way too much focus on background scheming, and there's way too much focus on the Wu and the Curie clan and the Westward faction and clones and brainwashing. There's so much stuff that's brought to the forefront that doesn't really add anything to the rest of the story. Now, all of that might be forgiven if the fighting and the main character were good, and neither of them really are. So I guess we'll start with the main character first, which is that we have a new main character. Oma is back, and he's instantly more interesting. But the problem is our main character is Koga. And Koga is not a very good character. Koga starts out with the perfect kind of arc where he's a reset. where, like, in the beginning of Ashura, Oma was already fairly strong, and then he had to become stronger, and he becomes stronger over the course of the series. Koga starts out not knowing anything, really, and the first 50 chapters or so are dedicated to, like, establishing him and him rediscovering, or I should say, discovering the Kengan administration or association after 2 years have passed since the Annihilation Tournament in the original series. So, through his eyes, we encounter all of the things and see all the changes that have happened in the 2 years since the original series. But the problem is that when you start out with a very weak character like Koga, he doesn't have a whole lot of opportunity to show off what he needs to show off and grow the way he needs to grow for it to be satisfying, because you're so focused on worldwide terrorist organizations and, like, mega corporation scheming, and he has nothing to do with any of this. So his growth story gets completely overtaken by all of the other stuff going on. And it's made worse by the fact that what happens is that the main first arc of Omega is a competition with another underground fighting organization called Purgatory. But the problem is that Koga is obviously not on the level of a top fighter. He's not on the level of the guys who we've already established are top fighters. So they take him out, and then he spends the next, 100 chapters on the bench. He, starts as our main character and then becomes an afterthought. And, this doesn't work. You can't establish a guy as, this is our protagonist, this is the world, who we're going to see the world from, and then just bench the guy for 100 chapters while you do a fighting tournament, and then go back to him like that didn't just happen. Because it immediately makes it so that he's not interesting. The other problem is that, remember how I said how in Ashura, all of the side characters don't overtake the main character? That goes out the window, because now all of the side characters are doing their own thing, and because they're all doing their own thing, we have to focus on them to the detriment of any main character. It feels like the series can't decide who its protagonist is. It feels like nobody has any idea who is leading this story. A good example of this is one of the side sort of co-main characters is Gal Ryuki, and I know I'm mispronouncing that guy's name, but basically his whole thing is he's a clone. It's obvious he's a clone, but he's a failure for some reason, so he is just out here killing people, and his journey is discovering what his purpose is. His purpose turns out to be killing the worm, and that's fine. But the problem is that, after the tournament, he just goes off on his own, and now we have to focus on multiple main characters who are doing independent things that have no connection, for the most part, with each other. And that's not good. That's very bad. It would be, it takes, there's no coherent core narrative going on, because everybody's out doing their own thing. Now, the other problem that I mentioned is the tournament and a lack of stakes. So, because this is a competition with Purgatory, you need to introduce new fighters. And that's fine, because they're mostly good. But the problem is that in Ashura, all of the fights have stakes, because everybody's fighting for things they personally believe in. And yeah, the fight with Purgatory is over the existence of the Kengan administration or Purgatory. Whoever loses is going to be absorbed by the winner. However, They don't bother to tell the fighters this. So the fighters don't have any reason, like, don't feel the pressure, and the pressure isn't expressed through their actions because they don't realize what they're doing. They have no concept of the things that they're fighting for the most part. And the bigger problem is that purgatory is about money. They don't, like, so the Kengan Association is all about corporations fighting proxy wars with fighters to solve disputes. It is essentially in order to get past problems, we'll have fighters fight in the background so we don't have to do all this crap in court. And that's fine. But purgatory is a very standard sort of like UFC underground organization where all of the fighters basically fight for titles and they fight for money. So it doesn't really mesh. Like, none of this meshes. Like, none of this works. Because none of the fighters in purgatory particularly have any, like, life or death struggle that they're fighting for. And they try to establish that kind of stake of, like, understanding why they want to fight. But almost all of them boil down to, like, oh, I want to be the strongest, or I want to find this one guy because I think he's my rival even though we've never met, or I want to fight for money. Like, there's no... It all pales compared to the motivations of, like, I'm fighting because if I lose, then, like, my livelihood will be destroyed. If I lose, then my entire village and everyone I care about will be evicted by the government and we'll lose everything. It's, if I lose, I will literally die impoverished. Like, there's not the same level of stakes, and so there's not the same level of investment. The other thing is that in Ashura, there's multiple stages. So when a winner wins, they then have to fight again. And so you get more time to develop them. Whereas in the Purgatory versus Kengan Association fights, it's always one-off. And so because it's always a one-off, nothing particularly, like, there's no like follow-up. So you introduce a fighter that we've never seen before, that we don't have any, like, personal ideas about or feelings towards, and then they it just, like, things just happen. Like, fights just happen, and it doesn't you don't feel the payoff. You don't feel the payoff after the fact. Now, they try to build some things up, but they're mostly failures. So, for example, they build up this guy who's called the Traitor Fang, because the Fang of Metsudo is the strongest guy basically in the Kengan Association usually, and has been for like 50 years. Like, there's been, at the time of Ashura, there were 5. In Omega, there's 8. Now, the reason for that is because the 6th one got the position and then defected to Purgatory for more money because he was a scumbag, and he is clearly a scumbag. And so you're like, okay, we want to see this guy lose because he's an asshole. And we're never really explained what happened to the 7th, because we only know about 4, 5, 6, and 8. Well, I guess we technically know about 1, but he's like 80. So he doesn't really, like, we don't see him in his prime. So at this point, we're mostly focused on 6 and 8. Now, the problem is that 8, while interesting, has not really been established as a main character or as a deep character the way is needed to make his fight interesting. And the fight that was kind of set up in theory and the fight that was kind of promised to the audience was the fight between 5 and 6. So, for example, it's established that obviously the Sixth Fang is a traitor. He beats up Koga. Koga hates him. You're like, okay, Koga is not going to beat a former Fang of Metsudo because the Fang of Metsudo is, again, final boss material. And when they're recruiting fighters, you see the Fifth Fang, who is in one of the strongest guys in Ashura, who the audience has attachment to. Like, we know him. And so we've seen him fight, and we've seen what he's been developed. So the thing that gets him on board is that he's told that there are now, like, he's the fifth. He hasn't been in contact with anybody for, like, 2 years. He's just been kind of out there, like, finding himself, basically, living as a biker, essentially. And then the recruiter guy shows up and he goes, there's been 3 successors to you in 2 years. And, oh, by the way, the guy who followed you is a traitor. And the guy's like, as soon as that happens, the Fifth Fang is like, okay, I'm in. When is this competition? Because I'm going to get in shape and fucking murder this guy. like that's the setup. Like, that's the entire setup for his recruitment is, oh, the guy who followed me betrayed the dude who gave me everything. I'm going to beat him within an inch of his life. Like, that's the fight they set up, and then they don't give it to you. They absolutely do not give it to you. And it's so unsatisfying. Because what you get instead is he fights a guy who went through the same, like, ritual that the Fifth did for the worm, and it's like, no one cares about that. Like, that's the least interesting part of this guy's entire backstory and history. Like, the whole setup is, the whole thing that matters in the fights is the emotional connection between the audience and the fighters and wanting to see people win. And so when you have such a clear villain who is being set up so that the audience absolutely wants to see this guy get his ass handed to him, you need to actually give it to them. You need to actually give the audience what you set up. And they don't. And so, like, he fights the Eighth Fang, but we don't have an attachment to the Eighth Fang because we haven't, like, had all of the fights and experiences to understand him and his connection. We don't understand how he's gotten to this position. Ironically, it would have been better if it had been either the Fourth Fang or this other guy who has always wanted to be the Fang but has never managed to achieve it. So, again, in Ashura, something that's much better is that there's this whole subplot with the 2 best bodyguards who are not the Fang for Metsudo. And one of them is the Fourth Fang, and the other one is this guy who holds this deep grudge towards the Fifth because when they were, like, teenagers and training together, the Fifth Fang just ripped his face open, and so he wears a mask to cover the fact that, like, his jaw is exposed. And, like, he gets his moment in the sun in Ashura because it's like he fights this guy who's like, yeah, you're just a dude who couldn't become the Fang. Like, you're nobody. And he just, like, takes a sword to the hand and just stomps on a dude's face. And he's just like, yeah, I'm a badass. And everyone's like, wow, that's great. That guy would be way better to be the guy to beat the traitor Fang because you have setup and payoff, and there's no setup or payoff here, and it's like that with everything. It's like that with all of the fights with Purgatory, where they keep all the things you want to see set up are not paid off. So for another example, they set this thing up with a guy named Nicholas, and the whole concept is like, Nicholas has this weird bloodlust where he wants to kill people. Or he doesn't get serious unless he's killing people, but he's in an organization that forbids killing. So he can't kill people. And he's very unhappy about that, but oh well. Now, it's unclear why he can't just go fight for any of the other organizations, because it's established that a lot of the other organizations allow death matches. So it's unclear why he's fighting for Purgatory in the first place, but that's not a problem. The weirder thing is that when you set up that he has bloodlust, you put him against a different guy who has uncontrolled bloodlust, and then they just kind of fight to a draw because they step in and stop them. And, like, it starts becoming, like, when his fight begins, there's a lot of, again, background information we don't care about, oh, the guy who's actually named Nicholas is dead, and, like, he's not alive anymore, and then he escaped. So, is this Nicholas, like, an imposter? Like, who is this guy? Is he a worm? Like, again, because all of this background bullshit with the worm constantly overtakes the rest of the series. And then it turns out, no, he's just a crazy motherfucker who thinks that the guy who is actually Nicholas was the world's main character. And then when he killed him, decided that because he was the world's main character and he's now dead, that means that he himself must now be Nicholas because he's alive. Like, that's, like, it's not interesting enough to be the plot line. And ironically, I think that the thing that really kind of soured me on the entire series, or at least Omega, like, I'm still reading it and I'm still kind of enjoying it, but it's not nearly as good. The thing that, like, really, like, made that clear for me is the longest running setup for the fights is this guy named King. Like, that's his title. And he's known as being the Monster of Manila. And basically, he's a guy who kills worms. That's his whole thing, because everything has to go back to the worm for some fucking reason. Like, they set up that he's a monster, that everybody's afraid of him because he's beaten everybody, that no one can beat him, that he's on the level of Kuroki Gensai, who is the guy who won and was the biggest badass in Ashura, basically. Like, in fact, the two of them apparently fought to a draw before, so it's like they set up all of this, they set up the fact that no one thinks this guy's gonna lose, because he's amazing, apparently. In fact, they, like, even, like, the Sixth Fang, who's a giant asshole and constantly picking fights with people, is like, mouths off, and then when the king is like, oh yeah, you want to prove that, do you? Like, the asshole Fang backs down, and everyone's just like, yeah, I'm not gonna fight that dude if I'm not getting paid. You're insane. And, like, in another moment, when the two, like, psychopaths are trying to murder each other, like, the guys who are running in to stop the fight are like, no, we're not trying to stop the two guys who are fighting. We have to stop them from fighting so that the king doesn't, like, destroy them both. Like, it's built up and built up and built up that this guy's like a monster. Okay? But the problem is that telling not showing is not an effective way to make us, the audience, invest in him. One of the things that Ashura did very well is that all of the monsters, whether it's Gensai, whether it's the Fang, whether it's Oma himself, whether it's Wakatsuki, I don't know how to pronounce any of these names. All these guys, basically, the reason why you believe them to be monsters is because they've had multiple fights where they've been built up and beaten strong people and been demonstrated to be like awesome. That's all of, like, every one of them has had multiple fights to convey upon the audience that these guys are all dominant, and when you see them fight, you're like, awesome, because obviously we've seen them be awesome already, so seeing them be more awesome again is satisfying. The problem is they build up the king, and so he fights Oma, but the problem is that it's obvious Oma's gonna win, because it's his first fight in the entire series, first of all. And the main character of the previous series is not going to lose in his first fight back in this series. It's just not going to happen, first of all. Second of all, we've had time skip power-up stuff, so it's not going to lose anyway. And so, really, we're just kind of like, okay, we want to see how he's progressed. But the problem is you can't do final boss and see how far the main character has progressed in the same fight. You can't do it. It's not something you can do. You cannot do... Like, normally what happens is, when you do a time skip power-up, is the first thing you do is you put them against an opponent, and so they get to demonstrate how far they've progressed by one-sidedly defeating them, the other person. And you're like, wow, he's progressed so much, and he's gotten so much powerful. So much more powerful. That's how you do that. You don't do that with the guy you've been building up to be the final boss. It just doesn't work. You just can't do that. Imagine if, like, in Dragon Ball Z, instead of all the fights between, instead of all the fights that happen on Namek with Goku and, like, the Ginyu Force, and then fighting, like, Frieza the first time and losing or whatever, or no, not fighting Frieza, fighting, like, Ginyu and losing his body, and then fighting Frieza after everyone else has been defeated. Like, imagine if instead he just showed up and was like, wow, I've gotten so much more powerful, and instead of fighting the Ginyu Force to show how much more powerful he was, he fought Frieza. And won. Like, that's how it feels. That's how it's structured, and it's not good. And so it just kind of, like... And then, like, the worst part is that the Kengan Association wins, and then they're like, well, actually, this whole merger thing is clearly not going to work, so let's just call the whole thing off. So it's just like, you wasted our time. Like, everything you decided and did has been a giant waste of time. And it's just... It trivializes a lot of things that shouldn't be trivialized, and it focuses way too much on the stuff that does not matter. Or I guess not that it doesn't matter, it's just not interesting. So, like, another running thing is, like, there's this guy from the Westward faction of the Wu, and he's a reincarnation, basically, except he's not, because what they establish is that the Wu has a practice where they basically brainwash people so that they think they're the same person. So, like, you take a child, and then the older person will tell them literally everything that they experience over and over and over and over and over again, until the child and the adult have the same personality and same way of thinking. It's brainwashing. But the idea is that by doing this, you create an immortal being, essentially, where, like, an immortal soul, kind of, because the person is passed on. So even when the older person dies, the younger person is a continuation of the older person, essentially. And they bring this up, and they do it, like, they bring this up, and then they explain that actually there's multiple people from every generation who have this done to them, because you need spares in case you get in like a car accident or something. And they build up this one guy, and then they kill him. They kill all of the spares, and then they just kind of have like a 2-chapter fight scene among characters we've never met before, one of whom is a clone of a guy we just saw got killed, and he's like, I'm gonna kill the last one, and now there's no more. Now there's no more. The line is over. Bye. I know we set this up for like 50 chapters, that this was super important, and whoever is the connector, like the next guy in line, is super powerful, but now we've killed all of them. So yeah, we're just moving on now. Like, this doesn't matter. And you're like, okay, that's really, like, not important. Why did that happen? And then they go one step further to make it stupid by introducing the original connector. So, like, the guy who was the connector for all the guys we've now seen die. And he has a completely different personality, which doesn't make any sense. Like, all of the dudes who we've seen are not all the same, first of all, which tells you that the personality problem, the brainwashing of we're going to turn every single next person in line into a copy of the original has not worked, and is more like a game of telephone where every single person is slightly different. Which, okay, that works. That would be an interesting plotline, but they're like, the guy that they introduce is like, oh, he's super dangerous and super strong, but also he's an airhead, and he's like a brat and doesn't care about anything and randomly does things like rename people. And it's like, there's no menace. There's no, like okay, one last bit. Speaking of no menace. So, the thing about the worm is that they spend a whole lot of time talking about the fact that the guy who runs the worm is a master plotter, is a master, is a totally ruthless and, inhuman dude who never does anything by accident, who's always thinking like 10 steps ahead, who involves himself in all manner of illicit trades. He's involved in cloning and, he kills people and then has people get reconstructive surgery so they can replace people in other organizations so that they can, get on the inside of them and stuff. And you're like, okay, every time we've mentioned this guy, he's always seen in shadow. We don't know his face. He's, this is obviously this has obviously got to be like a super powerful, super, intimidating dude, right? No, he when he's revealed, it's revealed almost offhandedly. And the guy is like, well, I turned the worm into a world organization. At this point, I could just, abandon the whole project now because I've done what I wanted to accomplish. And you're like, why? If all of this is meant to be in the background, if all of this is now going, no longer in the background, if all of this is now going to be our main plot line, you can't have your main boss be like, oh, I've already accomplished what I wanted to do, and now I really don't care anymore, so you want to just sit here and fish? Because that's what we're going to do. Imagine, in comparison, if, M. Bison from Street Fighter was like, yeah, Shadaloo has accomplished its goal, everybody knows us now, okay guys, everybody go home, I'm done, bye, and everybody left. And that's the problem. that's the core issue right there. That has the same issue. Another major, it would also be kind of like if Red Skull from Marvel Comics was like, okay guys, we infiltrated every organization in the world. We have Hydra agents in every government, and we're a world power, everyone's afraid of us now. We've committed terrorist acts all over the world. Okay, I'm done. We did what we wanted to do, guys. Okay, everyone shut it all down. I could just do that now. What? Way to just completely undercut all of the menace by making it so nobody involved in your world-spanning terrorist organization, who's supposedly the biggest threat to everybody, just doesn't care that they're doing things. It's not even a nihilistic, I don't care anymore because I've already won. It's not even a nihilistic, I don't care because nothing matters, and I just do things because I like destroying things. It's not even that. It's just kind of yeah, I could just give up and go home now. You think we should do that? And the other guy's like, nah, not really. I mean, I guess we can keep doing it. It's like, okay, I guess we'll just keep doing this for a little longer. That's the entire, way to just completely kneecap all the menace from, your bad guys. And then keep running with it like they're still the big bad guys. Like, everything that I've described, this is why all of the problems in Omega exist, because all of the bad stuff, all of the stuff that was the weakest in Ashura, are now being pushed as the main plot. Like, in some ways it reminds me of Bleach, where, like, they focus on all the Soul Society stuff, and then to follow that up, they were like, okay, what if we focus on the humans now? And it's like, but nobody cares about them. They're not important to the plot anymore. Why are you pushing the weakest part of your story to the front? Why are you making the weaknesses of your original story the primary focus of your sequel story? Because, like, it's just baffling, because it may be that, it might be that he only had one good story in him. It might be a case of, well, you were successful, so nobody's telling you no or restraining you. That happens a lot. Or it could just be that he's thinking he's going to go with someone, like, with something, and that it's working, and it's not. It's just not nearly as good. Like, Ashura is probably one of my favorite series of all time. It is perhaps one of the best series in terms of fight manga that have ever been made, in my opinion. And I don't say that lightly, because I am a mega critic who is super negative on a lot of things. But no, it's seriously that good. It is seriously great. It is a fantastic series. And yet Omega is just not a worthy follow-up. It is not a good enough follow-up to the original. And it's still ongoing, mind you. So it might turn around. I might have to eat crow. I might have to turn around and be like, actually, everything paid off, and it was all worth it. I really hope that's the case. I hope that that by the end of Omega, I can be like, I was completely wrong. But I don't think that's going to be the case, because into Omega, we are 2 time skips into this one series, and it's not getting any better. It just keeps hyper-focusing on all of the weaknesses, and it's baffling. So, yeah, that's all I got. This one ran like twice as long as all my other ones, because I'm not running off a script. So, hopefully y'all enjoyed that. I don't know what my next episode's going to be on yet. I'll figure it out. But anyway, that's episode 5. See y'all later.